resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I understand I have approximately 7 minutes left, and I'm going to focus the last 7 minutes of my questions on what I characterize as a good news story. And the reason why I want to do this is that I think it's a good example of how First Nations and proponents and governments can work together to resolve very long and outstanding issues. And I'm going to take you first to paragraph 102 of the Policy and Practice Report. And this is the paragraph that summarized a little bit about what happened with the Bridge River System water use plan. And in particular, it says specific circumstances delayed the controller's approval of the Bridge River water use plan until March 2011. Mr. Davidson, one of the primary delays in the approval of the water use plan was the hopefully and eventually the achievement of an agreement between BC Hydro and the St'át'imc Nation. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in fact, your approach was that because those negotiations were underway and that you knew that they may inform the water use plan, you encouraged the completion of those negotiations before a ruling on the water use plan.
That's correct. I think all parties involved kind of saw that as kind of an important factor to kind of nail before the water use plan was completed.
And in fact, the plan that was originally submitted in December 2003 got revised as a result of the negotiations that occurred between BC Hydro and the St'át'imc. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I'm going to take you now to tab 8, which is Exhibit 1861, but I'm going to ask my questions of Mr. Higgins, who has more, I think, direct understanding of this. And what I've first taken you to is page 14 of this agreement, and this is the St'át'imc PC settlement agreement between the St'át'imc PC, the BC Hydro, and the province of British Columbia that was concluded on May 10th of this year. You're familiar with that agreement, Mr. Higgins?
I certainly am.
And you're familiar with this section, in particular the generation operations section of that agreement?
Yes, I am.
And in fact, many of the matters that we've talked about, including an operating regime, the Seton Sockeye Smoke Monitoring Program, if you continue on, the Seton Lake levels, and the lower Bridge River flows that have now been implemented into the water use plan, came from the agreement that was first reached between BC Hydro and the First Nations and St'át'imc. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe all of those, with the exception of the lower Bridge River flows, which were already in there, but they were substantively modified through discussions between BC Hydro and St'át'imc.
In fact, the lower Bridge River flows was an active part of the discussions between BC Hydro and the St'át'imc for quite a long time. Is that correct?
Yes.
And figuring out an approach to those flows was a necessary part of reaching agreements.
Very much so.
And an approach to monitoring and implementing the agreement was also a part of that, correct?
Yes.
Now I'm going to take you to Schedule 5 and 6, which we saw a little bit yesterday. And I have lost the PDF number. Thank you. You're familiar with this document?
Yes.
And if I take you also to Schedule 6 of this document, you're also familiar with this document. It's useful to go through these page by page because it'll remind you of what's in there.
I haven't forgotten.
Now, you were actively a part of the discussions that resulted in these documents. Is that correct?
I was.
And you'll agree with me that one of the fundamental components of these discussions was trying to marry the complex relationship between the production of hydroelectricity and the release of flows for the purposes of fish.
Yes.
And that what these documents do is provide a staged approach for analyzing and monitoring different options that includes both traditional ecological knowledge, St'át'imc knowledge, and the trade-offs that are going to be necessary to make those decisions.
That's true.
And what was useful for the parties was to actually articulate that in a clear and measurable way so they could see that their values and interests and concerns were going to be addressed.
Yes.
And now I want to quit asking you yes and no questions and have you comment on both the challenges and the value of developing these types of approaches in your relationships with First Nations.
The challenges were great because none of us sitting around the table really knew how to do this when we first started. But it was through the exploration of our values and at the time we spent together that we did find a way that we could bring this information in. And in my experience in stream flow across the system, this has not been repeated anywhere else. And it was through those discussions and the collaborations which we were able to get a deeper understanding of what each other's values and a deeper respect for those. And that ultimately led to a place where we had agreement on what the best way forward was. So it was a very high value.
And you'll agree that some of those objectives included salmon and riparian health and cultural and spiritual qualities and BC Hydro's financial impacts. Those were all clearly articulated and are clearly articulated in these documents.
That's correct.
And in fact, you also articulated various alternatives and consequences and trade-offs specifically that could result. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the goal, in fact, in terms of the Bridge River flows, is to now implement a monitoring process. Is that correct?
That is underway already, yes.
And Statleam are going to be actively involved in that monitoring program. Is that correct?
That's true.
And that's going to be a benefit to BC Hydro and to the implementation of the water use plan.
That's true.
Now, the other thing I wanted to bring to the Commissioner's attention with respect to this agreement is something a little bit more perhaps complicated. You'll also agree that one of the things that had to be negotiated out as a part of this agreement was the socioeconomic impacts associated with Hydro's facilities on the Statland. Is that correct?
Can you clarify what you mean by that?
As part of the negotiations between the Statleam and BC Hydro, we were looking to resolve the footprint impacts on their territories, including their relationship to fish. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there was a fair bit of work done, to your knowledge, is that correct, on socioeconomic impacts?
That there was, yes.
And do you agree that that was a difficult process for the parties to come to terms with how to assess socioeconomic impacts to First Nations, and particularly the Statleam, as a result of the loss of fish?
100%, I agree.
And in fact, there were numbers of studies that were done that required very flexible approaches by BC Hydro and the Statleam in order to understand the socioeconomic impacts.
I agree, yes.
And in fact, at the end of the day, one had to look at not only those studies, but the benefits that this hydroelectric facility provided to BC Hydro.
That's part of it, yes.
I'm wondering if you could identify for the Commissioner our exhibit, or at tab 9. Are you familiar with this document? This was a document, and you'll see it's attached to an affidavit that was filed by, Tribal Chief Mike Leach?
Yes, I know Mike Leach.
And right now he's the chair of the Statleam Chiefs Council.
Yes.
And are you familiar with this document? This was the information package that was provided to the communities during the voting process on this agreement.
I have just recently seen it, yes.
I have that marked as the next exhibit.
1888.
And if you turn to page 7 of 11 of that agreement, you'll see that some of the financial payments associated with this agreement are summarized. And I just want to point to one of them in particular, which is the annual nation payments. It's your understanding that there are requirements for BC Hydro to pay to the Statleam over a 99-year period $440,000 per year for environmental and natural resource purposes, correct?
That's correct.
And to your knowledge, was that one of the goals of that payment was to ensure that the Statleam, rather than BC Hydro, could engage in mitigation measures on the ground as it relates to fisheries?
That was my understanding, yes.
And you'll agree that one of the goals and one of the reasons for that was that the Statleam felt that it was better for them to be doing fisheries mitigation in their territory than BC Hydro.
I couldn't conclude on why under those terms, but I do believe that what you're saying is true. I don't know what the Statleam were thinking on that. I know what I was thinking.
Do you agree on that?
I do.
That it's better for them to be doing the fisheries mitigation in their territory than BC Hydro?
believe it's better that we do it together than singly.
And in fact, part of doing it together, another component of this agreement, and it's marked already, but I just want you to confirm it, and we don't have the time to go through it. And a necessary part of the implementation of this agreement is something called the Relations Agreement. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that Relations Agreement is an ongoing working relationship between BC Hydro and the Stadtland as it relates to matters in their territory. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Including matters related to fish and including matters related to the implementation of the water use plan.
Yes, that's correct.
And in fact, it was necessary for the Stadtland to ensure that the water use plan would be implemented in a collaborative way with them, and they sought agreement with BC Hydro to do that.
That's the reason for it.
And so now are you looking forward to implementing this agreement?
Oh, if I was still working in the bridge, I would be. I think it would be very exciting.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Oops, sorry. Sorry, I am finished except for a document clear up, I think. Stanchik, I'm understanding that it's not clear that I have all the documents. Could we look at tab 5 of the First Nations Coalition's documents? Is that marked as an exhibit already?
1886.
And then 18, and then tab 6?
I believe it's tab 4 that may not have been marked if you had intended to mark it.
One of those ones. I think the BCF and the one before.
So let's just go through it methodically. Tab 6 is 1887, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And tab 4?
Not been marked.
Ah, there we go. Magic. Thank you. May I have that marked as an exhibit?
1889.
So close. Thank you. And thank you, panel members.
Nicole Chavez, counsel for Stola Tribal Council and Chiam Indian Band. If the commission could please pull up exhibit 1871, going to page, great, where's that here? It's either respectively page 21 or 25. It's page 25 of the PDF, I believe. Or the numbered page 21, correct, that's the one. If you could zoom in on the table, exhibit, it's named Exhibit 6. Thank you. So my first question is generally to the panel. One of the recommendations coming out of the Auditor General's report regarding groundwater, but it's a general, I'd see it as a general recommendation when it comes to water management, is want to actually implement an integrated watershed management process. And if you look at the figure that's being presented, it presents a way of looking at environment, economy, and society. And some of the points to be pointed out, for example, under society, points to taking into account land uses, flood risk, etc. So looking at this and being aware of the Auditor General's report and the recommendation, you'd agree that this is actually where we should be moving when it comes to water management and generally moving to integrated watershed management processes.
I think it depicts an end goal for integrated watershed management. I've seen many schematics of integrated watershed management, and this one is a good one.
And it's a goal that the province would be working towards to actually achieve integrated watershed management processes?
It's a goal that we're working on right now, aside from any legislative reform.
And I'm just gonna pass it on to your colleague from DFO as well. Mr. Wang, from a DFO perspective, when looking at those, obviously we probably want to add to that a priority for conservation of fish stocks and also indigenous uses.
Well, those are certainly things that are priorities on DFO's mandate, and I could see it fitting into a model like this.
And you'd agree with me, again, to the panel, that such a that this is basically a holistic approach at looking at water management and also land uses, etc., and that Indigenous peoples would have a key role to play in this process within their territories as rights holders, land users, and knowledge holders. Mr. Wang, I'll pass it on to you.
Certainly, I can see value in that.
And I take it the province does too. Could you confirm that on the record?
Yes.
When looking at the column over, lesson 2, on the same page of the exhibit. Spell check. If you could zoom in on lesson 2, but basically the warning that's enshrined in lesson 2 is taking a fragmented issue-based approach to managing our environment is time-consuming and expensive. And in the context here of groundwater management, the focus on source protection does little to build capacity to deal with other environmental hazards. Source protection should be nested into a broader planning policy program approach called integrated watershed management. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
And but looking at groundwater today and groundwater management, and I'm suggesting to you water management generally, this is not the approach that's currently being employed. We're not there yet.
I would disagree with not there yet. We've got a number of ministries in the provincial government and agencies that have specific mandates around, in this particular case, source water protection. Health authorities, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations, all have an integrated approach to water resource management.
But altogether have not been integrated to actually employ a fully integrated approach to have everybody at the table to make those decisions jointly.
There's a lot of tables in the province.
But
You're speaking in general concepts.
But there's not a table for actually integrated watershed management.
If the witness could please be
Sorry.
prepared to finish.
I can point to tables in the province, in basins or watersheds where there's exactly this happening.
Correct, but there's not an overall integrated watershed management process that's yet being employed throughout the province, correct?
As a provincial framework,
Yeah.
the Drinking Water Protection Act enables that. We've got a memorandum of understanding.
But for example, when it comes to, I didn't want to cut you off if you had wanted to add something else.
That's fine.
But when it comes, for example, to groundwater protection and even surface waters, you don't have an integrated approach to managing both yet in place.
We haven't yet incorporated groundwater regulation into water allocation, no.
So going on to the regulation issues, some of you were in the room, and I think Mr. Wang, you heard it as well, that we heard yesterday about the complexities of surface and groundwater flows, and that it's important when it comes to hydrologically active areas like riparian zones, lakeshore, etc., to actually conduct geomorphological studies and take all these issues into account. So to look at the complex interactions of surface and groundwaters. You're aware of that?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
But again, that is actually not what is currently happening. You don't have those fully integrated approaches to assessing developments, for example, in riparian areas in light of those interactions of ground and surface water flows.
In some areas, not.
Now, sticking just briefly with the example of riparian area regulation, this has been downloaded from the province. Well, it's basically in the hands, the decision making is in the hands of the municipality.
I'm not intimately familiar with RAR.
Okay, I'll come to you, Mr. Wang. There is an agreement between DFO and the province that if RAR requirements have been met, it's also deemed to have met Fisheries Act requirements.
Yes, that's correct.
And one of the concerns in that regard is actually that can lead to problems. If we could pull up Exhibit 662, please. And one of the issues there that you're actually specifically mentioning is that RAR is hugely problematic. Many local governments are not meeting the spirit and intent with regard to fish, and are taking the minimum compliance required approach, which is resulting in higher impact results than we had before RAR.
That statement, just for some context, I wrote that back in 2007. RAR was relatively new out of the gate at that time. The problem still exists, but to a lesser extent than it did when I wrote this.
But one of the problems is that the decision making regarding RAR, you are aware of that, has been downloaded to the municipalities. That's what you're stating in your paragraph, right?
Yeah, the statement is not so much the problem with municipalities being involved. It's that certain municipalities are, I guess, not necessarily taking the approach that I think reflects the spirit and intent of the RAR.
and also that sometimes they lack actually internally within the government structure of the municipality the capacity to actually independently assess the scientific information.
Yes, that's correct.
So there is actually cases today where developments could be deemed RAR conform, but they previously would have been considered to constitute a HAD.
Yes, that's correct. Although it's important to know that there are other sort of safety nets in the process where it's possible for government to intervene if we believe that a decision that is going to be functional under RAR is going to be significantly deviating from the expected intent. But there's still possibilities for, I would say, unintended results from the RAR exercise.
But generally within the RAR decision-making process, actually DFO has been removed as a decision maker. You're just notified of the information. You're not per se a decision maker.
In certain circumstances, but when that occurs, the intent of RAR was to have those circumstances be ones that were not causing a harmful effect to fish habitat. So the reason DFO is removed is there would be no need for us to render a regulatory decision in those circumstances.
And it sometimes puts your local staff actually exactly in that position that they have to say, look, we are actually not decision makers in regard to this.
That has happened, yes.
Now, so in some cases, then DFO is basically relegated to a decision where, to a position where, when it comes to development, you're mainly a recipient of referrals.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
But you are mainly, in regard to many developments, where you're mainly a recipient of referrals, but not necessarily the decision maker in regard to the development.
I'm not sure. There are times we get. There are projects that occur that do not come to our desk for a regulatory decision, and the RAR is one example where it's possible by following the provisions in RAR that a developer would be able to comply with the Fisheries Act, and so there would be no need for it to come to us.
And it's deemed to be under the protocol you have in place with the province.
Right.
Now, also when it comes to flood hazard assessments, for example, that is also delegated to the province, to the municipalities within their areas, right?
I would defer to Glenn on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Most many municipalities that are in flood hazard areas do flood hazard assessments. I'm not sure that there's
The responsibility for that has been, sorry, just to clarify, the responsibility for that has been downloaded to municipalities. It's no longer, actually, flood hazard assessments are not, within municipalities are no longer administered by the provincial government.
I'm not sure that I would say it's been downloaded. I mean, both municipalities and the province have done that type of work in the past. There's no legislative downloading or anything like that.
Now, Mr. Wang, remaining with that exhibit, you specifically addressed the issue of water use, and that you have no standards when it comes DFO, you're speaking internally, and that you're stretched to your limit to support various processes looking at water use and availability, and have limited capacity to deliver true expertise, many needs for data and little ability to gather the data. That's the reality you're faced with when it comes to water use decisions.
Yes, and I think I said as much earlier today.
And taking that back also to the context of when you're speaking with your relationship between the province and DFO, you're addressing that in paragraph 7, that there is difficulties or it's in a state of dysfunction, there isn't sufficient coordination regarding referrals, etc. If we were to look at this in the context of, for example, integrated watershed management as we initially discussed.
Again, there is some dysfunction there. I think I spoke earlier about that it's not meaning that there's nothing useful happening. There's a lot of local coordination, but it sort of functions on the basis generally of effective local relationships. Where those exist, I think things work reasonably well. Where we don't have those working, we don't really have a particularly good structure that coordinates the federal and provincial mandates as they cross over on fish and fish habitat.
So again, the area to actually evolve into when it comes to integrated, for example, watershed management would be to actually have the governments and also Indigenous peoples at the table to ensure more integrated and considerate decision making in that regard.
I could see that being very helpful in contrast to the situation we're in today.
Now, finally, I just have a few questions regarding surface water, unless my friend cuts me off right now. In the Fraser Valley, or generally when it comes to water allocations for surface waters, Indigenous uses of the area and also Indigenous water uses are not taken into account.
I would argue that most water allocations are done with some sort of a referral to the local First Nations to explore those uses or interests.
Okay. And in the Fraser Valley, you're looking at situations of oversubscription of water licenses?
There could be a number of areas that are fairly heavily allocated. I'm not aware of the Lower Fraser Valley as being generally like that.
Now, but you're aware of concern over pollution of water resources, including by fertilizers and other land uses?
Yes.
And including concern of over overuse and pollution of groundwater?
Yeah, there's a fairly heavily used aquifer in the Lower Fraser.
The Sardis Feather Aquifer?
Yes.
Which is also the main water supply for the city of Chilliwack. Right?
I'm not sure.
Am I putting you on the spot on this?
A little bit, yeah. I mean,
Sorry.
because we don't actively regulate groundwater use. I'm not as familiar with some of the aquifers.
Point well taken. I think it's also referred to in the report by the Auditor General. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shepherd.
Mr. Commissioner, I understand that Canada has no questions in re-exam, but the province does have a matter to clear up. We have sorted out the document issue, and I'll just allow them to pursue that now.
Yes, Cliff Prowse, for the record. If we could have, I believe that's Provincial Tab 8. Mr. Davidson, this is the booklet that we spoke of earlier that you would said you were a drafter of an early version.
I had some input into
Microphone, please.
I had some input into earlier versions of it. Yes, it's a guidebook for independent power production in BC.
If that might be an exhibit, Mr. Commissioner.
1890.
And then the next document tab there. This is the other document, July 2011. You're aware of this document with information requirements?
I am, yes, and this is a very recent document that just come online.
All right, if that might be an exhibit, Mr. Commissioner.
1891.
And Mr. Commissioner, one of the things that I had advised Commission Council, I was going to say you may recall, but that's always a bad thing to say. Several months ago, we had a session on ARAR, and the recent cross-examination, of course, went over some of that same territory. But since that session, I just wanted to put on record that the Court of Appeal of British Columbia has issued a decision in a case called Yonke, and so that's something that we'll all need to be aware of for final submissions on this issue. So I wanted to make that comment on record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prowse.
Mr. Commissioner, I have no questions in re-examination for the panel.
Mr. McGowan, you may not know, I'm not sure what our start time is on Monday. One of those days next week is a 9 o'clock start, but I'm not recall. Ms. Panchak may. Tuesday, all right.
Yes. Mr. Commissioner, I believe we're going to 10 o'clock on Monday, which is the commencement of the hearings on cumulative impacts,
Right.
at least the analysis of the authors of that, examination of the authors of that report.
Tuesday is the 9 o'clock start. Well, yes, thank you very much to Council, to Commission Council who prepared for this session yesterday and today. And today, Mr. Davidson, Mr. Higgins, Mr. Wong again. I have lost count how many times you've been here, Mr. Wong. And Ms. Kryboken, thank you all very much for participating and for being here today. Thank you. We're now adjourned.
Hearing is now adjourned until 10 o'clock on Monday morning.